tonight is a lay of the land, or the waters, we should say, on what's planned in terms of offshore wind. Where is it? Where is the process at? The values, the risks, and the impacts from offshore wind farms on ocean and marine life. Options for the way forward for how to get ahead of the process to make sure a smooth transition is done as best as possible with the least impacts on nature as possible. And also some ideas around what we should be striving for. So if you've been questioning things like, well, what info do we actually know about the ocean life? What are the impacts? How can we improve our understanding? And what are some of the ways forward that we can protect our oceans? Then you've definitely come to the right place. We endeavour to offer a perspective on all of these things. But I also wanted to acknowledge that this is a huge issue. It's very dynamic, just like water. There's lots of moving parts, and this webinar is really aimed at a high level first pass overview of what some of the kind of interests and issues are and solutions going forward. But it's not going to cover all of these in detail, and we do endeavour to provide more of these at some point in time with a range of other guest speakers. So we hope this gives you enough information to get your interests intrigued and sparked, and we'll endeavour to cover more as we go along through this journey, which will probably be quite a long journey. Not just tonight I'm speaking about. So how tonight is going to roll, we are going to be each speaking the presenters that you see on the screen now. We encourage everyone, if you've got questions throughout our talks, to please pop them in the Q&A section, which is a button on the lower half of your screen, where feel free to pop in questions and please address who your question is to, so then we can endeavour to answer them at the end. So now is the time that I'd love to hand over to Pat from Friends of the Earth, who's really going to give an overview about what's planned, where's the process at, just so that we can bring everyone up to speed. So thanks, Pat.
Thanks so much, Shannon. And just give me a moment. I'm just going to get my slides ready. So I'll just start my screen share. Okay. Can everyone see what I've got on the screen here? So yeah, before I get started, just to introduce myself, my name is Pat Simons. I coordinate the Yes to Renewables project at Friends of the Earth. I'm calling in from Wurundjeri country in the Kulin Nations. And yeah, it's just really good to be here with you all and talking about this really important issue. There is a whole lot that needs to be done when it comes to improving environmental protections for offshore wind, but I think that with organizations working together, we can definitely make progress on that. So as Shannon mentioned, I'll just be giving a bit of an overview of offshore wind, where are we coming from, where are we going, what's the process and the legislation that's been brought through, and where are we up to right now. So it'll be a bit process orientated, but bear with me, and hopefully it all makes sense, and happy to take questions at the end. So I won't spend too much time on this, but why are we looking at offshore wind? The chief reason comes back to climate change, the increasing severity of climate change impacts, and the need to rapidly transition the energy system to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. So offshore wind is just one of the key renewable energy technologies that will play an important role in that. And without doing so, we face increasingly severe climate change impacts. There are also some specific advantages to offshore wind as a technology. I won't go into too much detail here, but an important one is the difference between onshore wind and offshore wind, particularly the ability to generate more electricity at more frequently throughout the day, and the advantage of being negatively correlated with onshore wind resources. So basically, in Victoria's case, onshore wind in Western Victoria, it's generating electricity at different times of the day compared to proposed offshore wind in, say, Gippsland, where electricity is going to be generated through other times of the day. So that is getting us closer to a 100% renewable energy system. So that's some specific advantages there of why this is being proposed and put forward in the first place. Victoria is also particularly ambitious on offshore wind. So it's set and legislated a number of targets for the technology. The industry does not exist at all in Australia at the moment, aside from being in the early stages of being established. So we don't have any existing offshore wind projects, but the government is ambitious in trying to reach 9 gigawatts of new offshore wind projects by 2040. It's a long period of time, but it's also a significant challenge. And that's those plans and policies to have reached those targets are covered in Victoria's offshore wind implementation statements. So if you want to learn more about how Victoria is trying to get there, that's an important place to look. Another really important piece of legislation that basically covers all of the regulations of offshore wind in Commonwealth waters is the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act. It's a really catchy title, but basically it was set up to establish a licensing scheme to regulate the exploration, construction, operation, maintenance, and decommissioning of offshore energy projects in Commonwealth waters. So it does actually cover other technologies as well. So offshore wind, marine, wave energy, potentially solar. But generally speaking, the purpose is to look at offshore wind, which is the more commercially available of those technologies. So that was brought in 2021 under the previous coalition government, and it's still undergoing some changes in regulations. So that will affect things like management plans for specific projects. One really important point is that offshore wind projects are required to undergo EPBC Act referral, so the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Act. I'm sure everyone here knows a bit about that. So that's an important distinction with, say, the offshore oil and gas industry, which has some of its environmental matters regulated by NOPSEMA, and it's a good thing. So this is a slide that goes into a bit around what's the actual process for establishing offshore wind in Australia. We'll get to some maps in a moment, but I think the main thing I want to get across here is that there's a whole series of different licenses that are required from the first stage being looking at where you might even investigate offshore wind and where it could be developed, through to feasibility licenses, management plans, commercial licenses, and that's when you get into construction and operation of projects. So the first stage is establishing what is called an offshore wind zone. And so this process has already happened for Gippsland, and this is what happened right at the start. And as you can see, it's basically a number of shapefiles or blobs on a map which set out where the government is considering opening study for the development of offshore wind. So these areas don't indicate this is exactly where offshore wind will be developed, but this is where they were looking and considering. It's quite a large area, as you can see, but through that process, that's just the beginning of the consultation, basically. So in that period, there was public consultation, submissions, so on, and then that all goes into affecting what the next stage and decisions around what the offshore wind zone looks like. So that's already happened. So I'm just trying to give you a bit of an idea of the process and how that changes over time. So we started really big, and this is what the government actually came to a decision about in terms of where offshore wind projects could be developed. So three pretty large areas in the Bass Strait, and what this essentially does, it says to industry, this is where you are allowed to propose and potentially explore and build offshore wind. So these areas it won't be like completely covered in offshore wind. Sometimes people get a little bit thrown off by shapes that just kind of say, oh, is this whole area is just covered? But this is just about where projects can be proposed and potentially built. And that brings us to where we are now. So this map is taken from the Gippsland New Energy website. There's just a little link down there. It's quite a helpful website with a lot of information about renewable energy projects proposed across the region. And as you can see here, we've got those same shapes or blobs, but there's within it 12 different individual projects. So those are all projects that have been granted feasibility licenses. So what that essentially says is those companies can begin environmental studies, so they can go out and explore and map seabed, look at what marine mammals, birds, other species in the area are, and then that all goes into designing and redesigning their projects, and then putting in applications to the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Act, and then applying for future licenses to potentially get approval. So looking at this, there are a significant number of projects, but not all of these will, it's unlikely that all of these will be granted a final commercial license. It is a competitive process. And some projects might be better than others. They might have face different issues compared to others. That's something that I think that we're all going to collectively learn as we go along. But yeah, just to understand the process of how this is being kind of taken from quite a big study area, and then broken down into smaller, more specific projects over time. So that's where we're at now. There's also some key pieces of policy documents and advice and legislation that are worth considering. I've already mentioned the Offshore Electricity Act, so that's the governing legislation. There's the Victorian Offshore Wind Implementation Statements, which is a bit more like an industry policy document about how to get there. There's also this document, which is it's guidance for the offshore wind sector. So for companies that are proposing projects, and it's called Key Environmental Factors for Offshore Wind Environmental Impact Assessment under the EPBC Act. Bit of a mouthful, but pretty handy document that covers things like, what are the potential impacts on bird species, marine mammals, how do you mitigate things like underwater noise? That's something that we're particularly interested in. And so, yeah, it's really good that exists, and it's worth a look. Some other things that are relevant, you may know about Victoria's Marine and Coastal Act. That will be quite important, but less so for the offshore wind projects themselves, but more for the transmission, because that will run from the offshore wind projects in Commonwealth waters, cross into state waters, and then go into land where it's ultimately powering homes and services, industry, so on. That's all from me. I'm just basically introducing here's the basic building blocks of where offshore wind is at. We'll be getting into a bit of a discussion about what more is needed later. So really looking forward to that. So I'll hand back to Shannon for now. But thank you. Great to be here. If you'd like to stay in touch, here's my details.
Great. Thank you so much, Pat. So the next part of this evening, just checking that, has that come up okay for everyone? Yeah. Great, thank you. So the next part of the evening, we're going to be covering a little bit about some of the potential impacts to marine ecosystems that will need to be addressed by proponents looking to put these wind farms in our ocean ecosystems and coastal ecosystems, and then covering a little bit too on what are some of the gaps that we have seen and opportunities. So I also realized I forgot to introduce myself at the start. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shannon, the marine campaigner at the Victorian National Parks Association. And I've been keeping an eye on this all this offshore wind stuff for probably the last year or two. And really VNPA's role in this is really to look at what are the potential impacts and look for opportunities in our policy and legislation or potential new elements of those for what can be done to reduce and minimise and avoid impacts in the first instance as much as possible. So now just to cover a little bit about what are some of the impacts, and we likely know, many of us know many of these already, but it's worth just highlighting that there can be a lot of different impacts, some negative, but there also can be some positive ones too. So one of the most obvious ones is the direct sort of collision, for example, with birds, which are a very high risk species, and direct mortality, which Erin's going to be covering a little bit more detail about birds specifically straight after me. We've got habitat loss and degradation from the direct putting of wind turbines through the seafloor. We've also got the indirect effects and displacement from migratory species. So, for example, whales and marine mammals and fish, which are migrating from one area to another. There can be some potential barrier effects on species movements. And there are lots of other behavioural challenges in terms of where animals go to feed, breed, or simply migrate. And so birds are a really obvious one for, the blades of wind turbines, but there's other sort of less obvious impacts to, whales and fish, and really tracking, and for example, great white sharks, and really tracking their movements and the impacts on these. But also there is the potential for these structures to also create areas for more habitat as well. So that's just something else that just needs to be acknowledged too. So if we just drill down a little bit into the Gippsland offshore wind area, this map shows some of the key values in Gippsland. So this map was put together under Coast Kit by the state's Environment Department, DECA, who released a high-level marine values assessment of some of the areas, particularly for inshore in-state waters. So this map shows high biodiversity areas in the yellow areas, and the lower biodiversity areas in the dark blue areas. So really this just helps to give some extra context for, state values are really important to also consider in the offshore space, which is beyond the 5 nautical mile limit. But also it's something that we really would love to see, and that would benefit our oceans, is to be able to populate a lot of this data out into the federal waters. There's some stuff we know, there's still a lot of data gaps that we don't know, but through the work that some developers like Southerly 10 have already started doing, looking and really contributing to that baseline knowledge of marine life. New developers will be adding more to this. It's really hoped that we can create a much more certain picture around what marine life are here and the types of impacts that we're also going to be seeing on them. So this is going out from not only sort of the state waters, but also going out into our federal waters here. This is just a map we put together, and it's by no means comprehensive. It's just really a visual to illustrate where some of the critical areas are for particular marine life. So we just picked 6 of the high risk sort of top species, which really utilise the area around Gippsland and the waters. So we've got the great white sharks here, which you can see that in the green area is a nursery area for great whites, but they also utilise the area around the islands, probably a lot for those marine mammals, the seals. And also there's obviously a really high important area for the seals and some of those offshore islands sort of between the Prom and also Tasmania. It's a high area for whales too, humpbacks, southern right whales, and that whole blue area that you see here. And of course, seabirds like the shy albatross. So really, this is just a start, but it is really hoped that a lot more of this information can be gathered to get more of a picture on many more species that we really just don't know a lot about. And I think the key thing here is that from what we're hearing, there is some coordination between developers to look at how this data can be collected and coordinated a bit more throughout this area. And what we'd like to see, though, is a bit more coordination from state and federal governments to coordinate that process. And really provide some good leadership around what data is collected, the surveys that are done, and not only this, but the data that the developers will be collecting at their sort of locations, that can be really added to the regional picture to give a more accurate description of what marine life are where and what areas do we need to be avoiding. So yeah, and in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Erin to talk a little bit more about some of the more specific issues with birds specifically. But really, just to sort of move slightly over here in terms of what is the issue that we have been seeing in terms of how the industry is being rolled it out together with the impacts on marine life and the oceans, is that currently everything is being done under the EPBC Act, the environmental assessment process. And it has been really clear that this process is not fit for purpose for planning an entire industry over an entire region. Environmental assessment processes are usually highly specific to one project only, whereas these projects are going to be taking place over an entire region. And this has brought up questions for VNPA around the need for some marine planning that's done over a region to really bring together some of that work so that it's not so much in different silos with different projects, so that we get a much better idea of what some of these biodiversity hotspots are, and we're able to plan to avoid some of those areas. So one of the issues that we are seeing, I think there is some gaps in how that data is collected and coordinated to really add to that regional picture, as I mentioned before. But there really is a move from the rest of the world to move towards some strategic marine planning. So the question is really how can we move towards that picture, or at least be collecting data in the right way so that it adds to that picture later on. So there's a huge opportunity for greater government leadership, in this space, which we'll touch on a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Erin, who from Birdlife Australia, who's going to be speaking a bit more on birds. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks, Shannon. And some of my presentation will cover some of the same ground, but with a little bit more of a focus on birds. Sorry, just getting the screen to work. Are you seeing the black cockatoo at full screen? Great, thanks. So Pat said it, but I'll say it specifically in relation to birds. Climate change is a huge threat to birds. The action plan for Australian birds that was released a few years ago, that was looking at all of the data for all of the species, identified the twin threats of climate change and bushfire as the biggest threats to birds. And if we're going to address climate change or mitigate it, we need to transition away from fossil fuels to renewable sources. So that's why Birdlife as an organisation supports renewable energy when it's located in the right area and done the right way. So that's the most important thing for ensuring that offshore wind and any renewable energy really is going to be nature safe. It's got to be put in the right place, because if it's in the wrong place, there's not that much you can do about it at the moment. And those are the most important decisions. And Australia at the moment, when it comes to offshore at least, is at a good place, because none of them are built completely yet. We have the opportunity to do it right. So I'll just go into a little bit more detail in terms of potential impacts to birds. So obviously this is a new industry in Australia, but it's not new in other parts of the world. And we do have a range of studies from Europe and elsewhere around what the threats are. So as Shannon mentioned, collisions, so that's birds flying into turbines. They are difficult to quantify, because obviously if a bird flies into a turbine and it's killed or injured and it falls to the water, you're not necessarily going to be able to locate that bird and do counts or anything like that, like are possible on land-based sites. It requires special technology in offshore environments. So there is a lack of data even in Europe about that. So that's an example of the type of technology and how it works, where you need to have camera platforms and observer platforms in order to be able to monitor what's going on. The other big issue is displacement, which Shannon also mentioned. It's easier to collect data on that issue, and it is a really big concern for some species in terms of the impact to their ability to migrate or kind of feed or access breeding sites, and that they can be impacted over quite a large area. So in terms of studies from Europe, the barrier effects, this is just a really good visual from some studies in Europe that show the impact of what birds are doing in flight around an area. There can be injury from noise, and the other types of behavioural impacts that Shannon also touched on. The turbines can create a attraction in terms of something to roost on, or lights that the birds might be attracted to, and it's just generally altering the ecosystem. There are also obviously impacts at landfall, which not covering in this presentation, but the transmission lines are also a really big issue for Birdlife in terms of looking at where those transmission lines are going, what the habitat is, what the fire management regimes are around those pieces of infrastructure. And I think the offshore development needs to be considered in the context and at the same time as those transmission line infrastructure projects. We have a lot of information and preceding methodology guidelines and things to draw on to help Australia do this right, from Europe, internationally, from the United States. And there is science and modelling that's being developed all the time, including in Australia. And I saw some Birdlife local group folks on, they'll recognise some of the names in that report. So in Australia, as I said, we've got an opportunity to be a real exemplar if we can collect the right data to make sure we can cite these projects correctly and in a way that are going to have the least impact on birds. There are a number of different studies we can do that will help us do that. And that means we can look at both the citing and the mitigation options. So here is a real quick overview, I guess, of some of the studies that will help us to inform planning. So there are digital aerial surveys conducted from aircraft, and that lets the imagery be processed after the survey is completed and enables more time for species identification. That can also be linked to geographic positioning and provide flight altitude data, which then enables collision risk assessments to be made. Boat-based surveys also help to collect the right types of data in conjunction with those digital aerial surveys, because they allow closer observation of the birds, and they can add to the, I guess, quality of the information that can be collected in the digital aerial surveys. Weather radar studies, radar data studies also look at detecting flocks of migratory birds, and they give an understanding of the abundance and the flight patterns of those birds, what altitude they're at, and they can give 24-hour information that you can't necessarily get with flight or boat surveys. And then bird tracking studies, which obviously they involve specifically tracking individual birds to really give some more granular information about what's happening, and site-specific radar studies. Post-construction, because we've never done this in this part of the world, we don't know what the impact will be. We need to make sure we are studying that as well. The same types of studies are needed to check that there aren't going to be impacts post-construction, and this type of stuff needs to be thought about now as well. Those are some of the other types of studies. There's also the Motus wildlife tracking system, which some folk might have heard of, but basically it uses a cooperative network of radio telemetry to track smaller flying creatures, so birds, bats, and it basically means that researchers are cooperating by using each other's towers, but it enables a much bigger set of data to be collected. So we can do this. We're at a really good time to make these decisions if we can identify these areas where there'll be least impact. So I've just got a little video.
Offshore wind farms can
Are people hearing the sound there? Great.
have significant negative impacts on bird populations if placed in poorly chosen areas. Birds can collide with the turbine blades, and offshore
Oh, sorry. I did
wind
something wrong.
farms displace some species from their favoured feeding sites. They also create barriers to birds' daily movements and annual migrations. And their construction can damage marine habitats, affecting birds and other marine life. These impacts can be minimised by building wind farms in the most suitable areas. But how are these identified? A sensitivity map is a spatial tool that can be used to identify where the negative impacts of offshore wind farms will be higher or lower. For birds, we can assess the likelihood and severity of negative impacts for different species based on a range of characteristics such as body shape and size and behaviour. For example, flight height relative to the turbine blades, manoeuvrability in flight, dependence on specific habitats. To map sensitivity, we need to establish where seabirds are distributed at sea using available data, which may include survey data from boats and data from tracking tags on birds. Sensitivity maps often take the form of gridded maps in which the overall value or sensitivity of each grid cell is influenced by the combined sensitivity of the species present and other environmental factors. Sensitivity maps are a powerful tool to inform the strategic planning of offshore wind in a way that benefits the rapid transition to renewable energy at sea and the protection of the marine environment. Offshore.
So that was a really quick video about the AV-STEP sensitivity mapping tool that BirdLife International has developed that we are looking to also develop here in Australia. We're in the process of doing so. But first, I just wanted to give a really quick case study to demonstrate that this has been done. This type of sensitivity mapping to inform project planning has been done really well in some other parts of the world. And we can also learn from the ways that not done it so well. So this case study is from the United States, where in New Jersey, where they conducted really, really comprehensive baseline studies that look using a lot of those techniques that I covered earlier to develop this really detailed sensitivity mapping for offshore wind off the coast of New Jersey. So it is something that Australia is in a good position to do, particularly because we can learn from the experience in the US and Europe and do the right thing here. So as I mentioned, so Birdlife is working on AV-STEP. That's one type of sensitivity mapping. There's a lot of other work that needs to happen as well, and other decision making that will go into the offshore planning process here in Australia. But we are in the process of developing that in a number of areas across the country for both onshore and offshore renewable energy. I think I will leave it there because I've already gone on for a little while, and I will pass back to Shannon.
Thanks so much, Erin. That was great. So there was a question put in the chat, and it's a really good segue to our next presenter, because we've been doing wind farms on the land for longer here in Australia, and so there's many lessons that can be learned from the land and applied to the sea. So Bronya from Clean Energy Council is going to be covering some of those important issues now once I get her presentation up to share.
Thanks, Shannon. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start by acknowledging that I am on the lands of the Yagara people and the Turrbal people here in Meanjin, otherwise known as Brisbane, and pay my respects to elders past and present. For those who are unaware, the Clean Energy Council is the peak body for the renewable energy industry, and that includes all different types of clean energy, and really works hard on how to facilitate a transition so that we can reduce climate emissions and make sure that our coal-fired power stations and our reliance on gas is phased out, and so that we do rely on renewable sources of energy. We have several strategic pillars. One of those strategic pillars is that renewables are done right. And part of what that means is that renewables are subject to robust environmental impact assessment, and that the renewable energy industry is doing what it can as it through the transition to be really responsible developers and operators. Next slide, please, Shannon. So I'm going to cover what I've been learning and working with members on around bird and bat impacts in particular from wind farms, which is one of the biggest concerns around the rollout of the wind industry, both onshore and increasingly offshore, as we start to develop our offshore wind industry and develop those environmental management plans that will come with those feasibility licenses, and then eventually be some of which will eventually be approved in theory if this all goes ahead. We'll talk a little bit about why avoidance is so important in this context. And as Erin was saying, avoidance is one of the best ways that we can avoid impacts to birds and bats and other types of marine life. And part of the way that we develop avoidance or good avoidance practices through things like spatial planning. And then I will also touch on what we can do to make life a bit better for our marine species. And at the next slide, I'm just going to put a caveat here. I love memes. I also have a lot of problems with the planning framework and its suitability for something as enormous as the renewable energy transition generally. Our environmental laws, our planning frameworks are not fit for purpose for something as enormous as the energy transition. And they're certainly not fit for purpose when we are at the confluence of three interconnected and very wicked problems, which is climate change, extinction crisis and an energy transition. And so, as Pat mentioned, there's a whole bunch of work being done at the moment to work through what the legislative arrangements are going to be and what the approvals processes and assessment processes are going to be. But really what we've been doing is tweaking around the edges of a planning framework that's not really great, but this is where we are. And that's certainly been the case with the onshore experience. And part of the reason I am in Brisbane at the moment is because I've been at a 2-day conference just on environmental impact assessment. So there's a lot of people that are thinking really, really hard about how to reform the system so that we are adequately providing and appropriately applying reforms to make sure that we've got a planning and an impact assessment process that is actually fit for purpose for things like offshore wind and onshore wind. So what do we know about bird and bat impacts from the land? Well, we know that they're very real. They happen, depending on where something is sited, they have different degrees of impact. And we also know that there are some species that are more at risk than others. A lot of developers around Australia, and wind farm operators around Australia are required to undertake monitoring as part of their post-construction conditions, and they are also required to develop what's called adaptive management plans, and those things are there to start to understand risks and how to mitigate those risks as they potentially arise. And we know that some of the ways that you avoid risks or mitigate risks for some species don't work for others. In the case of a few different species of bats in Victoria, for instance, you can implement a range of mitigation measures to avoid impacts to certain species of bats, but they do absolutely nothing for other species of bats. So there's still a lot of still a lot of work to be done about what those species are that are most at risk, and then how do we develop mitigation measures to avoid those risks from occurring in the first place. We also know that in a hierarchy of threats, climate change and feral animal predation rank significantly higher than wind turbines when it comes to impacts to birds and bats. That is not an excuse for saying that we don't control what those impacts are, but it is saying that any additional threatening process needs to be controlled, and that includes turbine strike. Unfortunately, though, we can put a lot of controls on different types of development, but they're not doing anything to address those other threatening processes at the same time. But there is definitely a role for the renewable energy industry to be playing in controlling and managing those other risks as they're occurring as well, which I'll talk about in the context of regional planning. And there's also, if we go back, there is a lot of data. Data has been collected on birds and bats and wind farms for the couple of decades that we have been developing the wind industry onshore in Australia. It is collected as part of environmental impact assessment documentation, and it's certainly collected post-construction when there's mortality monitoring requirements. So there's tons and tons of data. The problem with that is that it's not actually used properly. So despite the fact that developers are required to undertake data collection for a range of reasons and submit it to departments, a lot of that data then just goes and sits in a drawer on a hard drive somewhere that gets corrupted at some point. That data can be used to be doing things like understanding what the risks are to certain species, what areas are more at risk than others, how does that data contribute to things like spatial planning, how is that data used to understand the way that certain flying critters do interact with wind farms, and what are the solutions to all of this? How can we start to pull out what the mitigation measures are and the best avoidance measures are by using the data that's already there? Next slide, please. So impacts can be avoided and they can be mitigated. So it's been mentioned a couple of times now that where something is sited is really, really important. In the onshore space, siting can be tricky for a number of reasons, including a lot of those lower hanging fruit sites are already taken. So those sites where there's going to be potentially less impact, but also has high a wind resource have largely been snapped up. But that's not to say that you can't or shouldn't be putting a lot of thought into where you're actually siting the wind farm and then where you're siting individual turbines within that wind farm itself. So things like strategic land use planning and regional planning, as is being proposed in the federal environmental laws, are really, really important, because they let everybody know, developers included, what those areas of high biodiversity value are, and then how we start to plan renewable energy projects that is taking that spatial planning and those high biodiversity values into account. We do know that there's mitigation measures that work. So mitigation measures are usually employed to reduce the impacts where avoidance has been exhausted. Mitigation measures, there's quite a few of them. There's also quite a lot that hasn't actually been trialled in Australia. So while there is a whole lot that we can learn from the international experience, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to understand what mitigation measures work best for certain species. Some types of mitigation measures that we know work are things like smart curtailment. There's a few excellent like AI-based type detection systems that can sit inside wind farms and can identify different species. And as those species get closer to the turbine, that turbine is shut down so that it avoids the birds hitting them. There's a couple of wind farms, or at least one wind farm in northern Tasmania that's been using this, and it's been quite successful. So we know that there's those kinds of things that works, but we also know that there's a whole bunch of others that need trialing. Part of the inadequacy of the planning framework at the moment is that because we're just looking at things from a project impact perspective, and we're not looking at things holistically, we're not really, there's not a lot of scope at the moment for trialing what other mitigation measures might be. And those could be any number of things around deterrence type mechanisms to get bats to fly around or avoid wind farms altogether, and different types of mitigation measures that might be available to avoid bird impacts. And impacts can certainly be avoided by regional restoration efforts that reduce other key threatening processes. So one of the most exciting features of things like regional planning, as is being proposed in the federal environmental law reform, is that you will have areas that have been designated for development, and you'll have other areas that are designated for restoration and recovery activities for the environment and to be producing nature positive outcomes. And a lot of those nature positive outcomes will be successful where we can actually remove those other threats or control other threats as much as possible. And certainly a lot of the members that I speak with in the wind industry are really happy to participate in that. They don't want to continue to be part of the problem. So where we can have spatial planning and regional planning that introduces restoration efforts that go towards reducing other key threatening processes is a really great way to help species and ecosystems recover as much as we possibly can as we continue with our energy transition. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for offshore wind development and marine and migratory species? One thing I haven't mentioned earlier is that there's a need for really early and proper engagement with First Nations communities and traditional owners. The CEC earlier this year put out a leading practice guide for developers on how to actually do that by operationalizing the 10 principles from the First Nations Clean Energy Network. Sea country is at risk from any kind of development, and there's a real need to understand what the impacts to cultural heritage will be, and how to start planning for that early. Marine spatial planning is really important. There is a way we need to be identifying a range of where the high biodiversity value areas are, and what species and ecological communities or marine communities are more at risk than others, and how we can actually plan around that so that we are either avoiding those places or we are working through how to contribute to other kinds of restoration or recovery actions, as we might have to do through regional planning when that comes into force. But it's also a really good way to be thinking about how to address potential cumulative impacts now. Most developers are required to do cumulative impact studies. A lot of that information is not actually used in any kind of way once that has been done. So how can we utilize the data that we have available to us now to understand those cumulative impacts, and how can that knowledge of, or the beginnings of that knowledge around cumulative impacts, go into marine spatial planning? Just as there is data for onshore species, there's also data for offshore species. And whilst there's a paucity of data generally in this country around biodiversity, because it's never been a priority for any government at any time, there's still quite a bit of data that we can be using now to be collected from the various places where that data will be held, and to be feeding that data into things like marine spatial planning, so that we can have a better understanding of what critters are out there and who's at risk. We've been developing offshore extractive industries for a very long time. Those folks will have a lot of monitoring data and impact assessment material data. That kind of thing can be gathered now, so that we can work through it to understand who's in the water or who's flying around, and how we can be avoiding and mitigating impacts to those critters that are out there. There is, of course, going to be a whole lot of feasibility studies undertaken at the moment. Those licenses have been granted for the Gippsland offshore wind area, and everybody basically is going to be doing the same thing in the same area. So what are the ways that we can share that data that's being collected by working with each other, by working with government, by working with communities who will also have information about what animals are out there and what birds are out there and how they're behaving, and pull that together in a way that is going to inform spatial planning, but is also going to not require a whole lot of people going out there and doing the same thing at the same time. Just as there is a lot of consultation fatigue, there's also, the consultation fatigue is one of those things that we've got to avoid with the offshore space as well, because that's very real. But how can we be pulling together the data that we've already got, or that we have to collect anyway through feasibility license studies, in order to be reducing the need for consultation and be reducing the need for 12 different companies going out there to do the same thing. Similarly with monitoring, there's a way that hopefully we can share the monitoring data that will come out of those feasibility studies, and that will also feed into a better understanding of what the cumulative impacts will be. And then finally, there's mitigation measures that we can be thinking through now, and how to embed them into assessment frameworks, and how to embed them in decisions when they're finally made. As I mentioned, there is a need to trial certain mitigation measures where they haven't been undertaken in Australia, but we know that they are potentially successful for other species and other jurisdictions. So why are we not pulling what we know about those things now and thinking about how we apply those in the Australian context? So a lot of things that we can be doing. This is a very, very complicated space. Like impact assessment and understanding our marine environments and our terrestrial environments is complicated. But I do certainly think that there's a way that we can work together to understand what the risks are, to plan better in the areas where these developments are going to be, how we avoid those impacts, and how we successfully mitigate them to the extent that we can. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Bronya. Great stuff. It was so much in there, I think, to give everyone to think about in terms of where we're heading. So that's a really great segue to our second last proceedings of the evening, which is really just giving all of the guest speakers an opportunity to summarise what we should be striving for in terms of reaching our goals for minimal environmental impact and environment protection, as well as ensuring a smooth transition. So, and also what you can do to really help with this, because we understand that You know, it's a big issue, and it's hard to know sometimes where you can add value or participate in the process. So I know that many of our organisations have got either released documents to read and get up to speed, or opportunities to help. So if we can maybe just share a couple of those things. Pat, I might start with you.
Yeah, sure, Shannon. So those presentations were great. That was such a wealth of information and knowledge. So thanks, everyone. I really think that I'm zeroing in on the marine spatial planning because it seems like it touches like a whole number of different things. You know, we need, better data and bringing together all the sources of data. That's essential to marine spatial planning. You know, we need to deal with different competing uses in the marine environment. And I think that it is a bigger reform. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be easy to get over the line, because it would be a significant reform to how we're doing things at the moment. But I think that would make a really big difference. In Bronya's presentation around comparing onshore and offshore, we didn't do that in the past, and so yeah, we do have that opportunity to do things differently with this new industry. That's something that I would really like to see. But I think it will require people getting involved and support from different organizations, and probably applying some political pressure, as well as working with good people in industry that want to see good practices. I just saw there was a little comment in the chat just around how should people in communities be engaged, and there's a proposal that we're working on with some other groups in the climate movement for this idea called local energy hubs, and I'll share this in the chat. But basically, there is a need for governments to provide greater information and knowledge to communities that are grappling with these changes, and that needs to be coming from people that are seen as trusted sources of information and getting down on the ground. So local energy hubs is a way to do that. There's a big energy transition all around the country, so we're calling on the federal government to set up a network of local hubs where that provides information about renewable energy projects, as well as supports people to set up their own, or in the home or in the community. So we think that would be quite a important program to help people that are often, it can be confusing when you're looking at like 12 different projects plus transmission and other projects. So we really need to do a lot more community education and support people to actually be part of shaping this industry.
Thanks so much, Pat, and thanks for asking that question as well. I had you down to ask that later, so I can tick that one off the list. But Erin, over to you.
Thanks. And yeah, I found all of the presentations so helpful as well. I've learned a lot watching everybody else. I guess I think that what can we do to get a good outcome is, I guess, the main question that I think everybody is probably here wanting to answer. It's a bit hard because it's like, what do we want? Marine spatial planning. When do we want it? The time that it takes to get enough data and know that we're doing the right thing. But I think it really is. It's a process of I think putting pressure on government to do a better job at strategic planning, as Bronya was saying, because at the moment the market is dictating what is happening both on the land and elsewhere. And I think that is a big reason why communities are feeling really anxious about this, because stuff is happening and everyone is saying, yes, renewable energy is what we need to do and it needs to happen as quickly as possible. But when you're there and you're seeing the potential threat to, really important habitat, it becomes a much different question. And I think we just need to be really aware that it is a large industrial scale of development that's happening, but also that we have the opportunity to, do this industrial revolution in the right way and not repeat the mistakes of the past. I think how we do that is a combination of putting pressure on decision makers, but also leading the way from community and, you know, groups and scientists, as Pat was saying. So I know a lot of work is happening by different scientists doing various different types of mapping for onshore renewable as well as offshore, and, you know, Birdlife is working on that. There are a lot of proponents, particularly from some of the international companies, that I think are finding the lack of regulatory guardrails in Australia somewhat puzzling, and are wanting to do the right thing and, you know, potentially cooperate. So working with them, I think the other thing, I guess, is just to, I think, because there is so much happening, and I'd be interested to know what Bronya thinks about this, but there's a lot happening. It's happening really fast, but also we're still at a point where we can influence a lot. So it's not like the horse is bolted, particularly with offshore, with a lot of other onshore wind development as well, because I know there's a lot of familiar names in the thing of people, you know, who have concerns about that. So we've got the opportunity to influence this, so let's seize it. Let's not just kind of feel like, oh, it's too late.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's, on the one hand, you know, the horse is kind of bolted, but on the other hand, it hasn't. Like Pat was saying, there's a very long lead-in time for the offshore wind industry at the moment, and that time should be utilized to understand and plan for what we can understand about what those impacts are going to be and how we avoid them, and what are the outcomes that we want to see for those areas. One of the worst things that governments in Australia have actually done is drawn circles on a map and said, this is where the renewable energy transition is going to happen. Like, they are not planning instruments, and they have created a situation where a whole lot of people have gone in thinking they've got a green light for development, and a whole lot of communities who are really concerned about what that means for them, and then a whole lot of concern around what the ongoing impact to the environment might be. So how do we also learn from that failure of utilizing the renewable energy zone idea, so that we don't repeat that offshore, where it's going to be 10 times more complicated, 10 times more expensive, 10 times more time consuming, 10 times more stressful for everybody involved. I think that there is like that, like, planning for what these things look like is really important, but it is going to take some time, unfortunately. For the offshore space, I think that's a bit better than what it is for the onshore space, because we do have more time. I just want to get to a couple of questions in the chat that have been directed at me. One is around who's coordinating the mitigation measures that I'm suggesting. So that's a really interesting question, because on the one hand, you know, developers will put forward mitigation measures through their impact assessment material and see what departments say, but there's not really a coordination as such, which is something that the CEC has been working with various departments around the country for a while, to say, this is what we understand, what some of the mitigation measures are successful in other jurisdictions. These are the things that we think that need to be trialled in Australia. How can we actually get that to happen? So the answer is not really anyone at the moment, but kind of sort of us at the moment as well. But I'm sure that governments would want to hear from communities as well. There's another question there around are we relying on project developers doing the marine spatial planning rather than having it done by government departments? I mean, it's kind of happening by default, but it's happening in a way that's not coordinated at all. And when I say kind of happening by default, what I mean is that there's a bunch of people going out there and undertaking surveying and monitoring that's not actually being used in a coordinated way, or there's not actually a process for that to be used in a coordinated manner, so that we can actually get it to feed into spatial planning. There's a significant need for government to step in here as well, because the energy transition is something that is extremely beneficial for everybody that's going to be receiving the benefits of it, namely the community. So how can governments be really involved in that data collection and that surveying process, rather than just leaving it to developers? Or, you know, there's some questions that I have around what good policy is when you're relying on the private sector to be providing all the information for you. So there's a real need to get governments involved in this, so that they are playing a significant role as well.
Great. Thank you. Well said, everyone. I definitely concur, and maybe just to add a little bit of our own flavour as well, but really backing up the fact that we need to be making moves towards coordinated marine planning, marine spatial planning, and it really there needs to be part of it that's dedicated to the oceans, because as we know, water is so complex and dynamic, and we really need to, not be watering down outcomes for the ocean. So, making moves towards that is the critical thing that we also see. Saying that, given that the Gippsland offshore wind zone has already issued feasibility licenses, there are some really important immediate steps which others have already touched on as well, that can be done to really add to that more regional sort of strategic planning approach. And really that's for government leadership in terms of doing regional surveys, baseline surveys, and that data collection element, so it can actually be used and coordinated. And that's what we're really hoping to see for Gippsland, as well as more broadly as well. So did anyone else have anything else to add that's come up since you've heard the others speak that you wanted to add before we jump into some question time? Great. One more thing I did want to add is that VNPA, just to add to the others list of some useful resources, we've also released a discussion paper called The Winds of Change, which I might get Jacob to pop a link to that in the chat if anyone wants to read it. It just it covers more on marine spatial planning and how it can be used as an ally to really help the transition and look at the minimising impacts on the oceans. So we've got quite a few questions here. We might not get a chance to address all of them, but we'll start off with Ray's question, which was asking around mapping of the seabed and negative impacts from that. From my understanding, it's I guess there's always going to be impact when there's going to be boats going out onto the ocean, but there's a very clear distinction between the mapping and, for example, seismic surveys that are done for offshore oil and gas, and very different from what we're looking at here from offshore wind. The offshore wind surveys are much lower frequency and do not have as much impact at all on marine ecosystems. So I just wanted to address that one first, because I think there has been a little bit of misinformation sort of spread around the impacts of that, but there is a clear distinction there. Not saying that there's no impact, but yeah, very, very different to offshore oil and gas. Pat, I might hand over to you for Jenny's question, which is there bipartisan support for offshore wind in Victoria?
Yeah, thank you. So my understanding on this is the coalition in Victoria haven't necessarily come out with official support for the industry, but there are some key MPs that have been public supporters of offshore wind, particularly people like Danny O'Brien, who's the Nationals MP for Gippsland, and yeah, we have not seen them overtly come out in opposition to the industry. There's often people on the edges that can sometimes just be against all renewables. But in terms of party policy, I'd say they're like holding a relatively neutral stance, but like yeah, there are some key MPs that have been public supporters.
Thanks, Pat. So Karen's got a question: will the new national EPA be an additional resource in helping to develop data and protect marine life? Bronya, correct me if I'm wrong, if you've already answered that, but did you want to have a crack at that one?
Yeah, sure. So the new federal EPA will largely have a role around compliance and enforcement and, in theory, decision making on applications. the Environment Information Australia will be the statutory body or independent body that will be undertaking a lot of the data collection, additional research, etc. So it's kind of like a tag team between the new EPA and the new Environment Information Australia, who will work to understand what information we have, what information we need, how we get that information, and then how we actually coordinate and collate that information and make it available to the community and to proponents.
Thanks, Bronya. Erin, I've got the next couple for you from David and Peter. So from experience with onshore turbines, are there unique or unusual features in Australia in regards to bird impact? And also any deterrents for turbines to move birds away from them?
So the first one, the answer to that is yes. So I guess a lot of the, and I will just preface this by saying I'm not an ecologist. And so if anyone has any follow-up questions, I'm really happy to take them on notice and chase up my extremely learned colleagues at Birdlife. But essentially, because a lot of the data comes from Europe and North America, where the species are very different, they tend to migrate in a different way to birds in Australia. That there is there are some different impacts. So, for example, we have migrating parrots that cross the Bass Strait. That's not something that European studies are necessarily looking at. In terms of deterrence, so I think the answer to that is there's a number of technologies that are being looked into and being trialed, and I think Bronya perhaps mentioned one of them. There's no kind of really clear methodology to keep birds away from turbines that we know of at the moment, which is why the sighting is the most important thing in the first instance. Although there is a lot of kind of research happening into different technology to, create deterrence.
Thanks, Erin. So I've got a question here from Gregory Taylor. So I might just throw this out to anyone who feels inspired to answer. It seems that the panel is suggesting very basic and essential aspects of environmental planning that need to occur before large projects such as wind farms go forward. Is it really the case that no one in government is working on this? Is this really just being left up to NGOs?
I will have a crack. The short answer is no, it's not just being left to NGOs. And NGOs play a really, really important role in what good environmental planning can be. As I mentioned, the ideas and the frameworks around regional planning that's being introduced in the federal environmental laws is one of those very things. That work has got a long way to go, but they are thinking about, where in an area are the best locations to avoid impacts, where are the best areas to develop sort of generally, and what are the avoidance and mitigation measures that can be put in place for those developments in those development areas, and then what are the other ways that we go about undertaking restorative and recovery actions to give species and ecosystems produce a nature positive outcome for those species and those communities. That said, like I think a lot of it is pretty poor. There is a real need to get as many people together as possible and get them to roll up their sleeves and to start planning this stuff properly. That includes government, that includes NGOs, that includes industry bodies like mine, and developers generally. So I think creating a process where people can actually get together and work through it together, and produce the best outcomes for the energy transition and for our environment and our species together, the better off we're all going to be in the long term.
Right. Thank you. We've also got a question here around the migratory routes around whales. And feel free if others want to chip into this one. But I think we really don't know enough, particularly here in the Southern Hemisphere, around what the impacts on whales would be. There are, from my knowledge, some studies in other parts of the world, but I think that's, definitely an area up for discussion, and maybe some developers from some studies that have been done so far can shed a light on some of that as well. I think we'll just go for one more question, and this is to you, Erin, around overseas evidence of bird strikes on turbines, and is it related to height or sound, etc.?
My understanding is that it's generally related to height rather than noise disturbance, but I think it probably depends on the species. So I'm happy to follow up with that person directly, with any kind of more detailed information if that's helpful.
Thanks, Erin.
I just would jump in, like for bats, there are a few different deterrence measures. I know that we're not really thinking about bats in the offshore space, but there are deterrent methods out there. And then things like the smart curtailment system that I was talking about before, where the program, like the cameras are actually able to identify the species of birds that's flying towards the turbine and can turn the turbine off so that it avoids impacts. It's not a deterrent, but it's certainly a really successful way of birds not hitting turbines. So there's a range of things out there, but a whole lot more work that needs to be done.
Yeah, and like this is why it's sort of, it depends what species are involved, and how big they are, whether they're there all the time, that kind of thing.
Right. Well, just in the interest of time, we're going to have to cut the Q&A there. So apologies if we didn't get around to your question, but hopefully that has been really helpful for everyone to get a much better understanding about where we're at, where we're going, and potential opportunities and solutions going forward. I just wanted to invite our guest speakers to, if there was any last words of wisdom you wanted to share before we close off the evening. No takers. I think we've covered a lot of ground tonight, and I just wanted to thank all of you, Erin, Bronya, and Pat. You've been so great to work with and learn so much, and I think each of our organisations has a slightly different angle, but it's been so great to learn and work with you in pulling this webinar together, and looking forward to continuing to do it into the future. And thank you all for joining us at home. This webinar was recorded, so thanks Jacob, who's on tech duties behind the scenes. We'll send out a recording and make it available if you wanted to share it around, and perhaps we can share some of the resources that we've mentioned tonight to follow up. But thank you so much again, and we'll be in touch if we do a 2.0 offshore wind webinar at some point. Thanks so much.